Justin Baldoni's lawyer strolled up to those TMZ cameras on June 1st, and let me tell you, the vibe was absolutely unhinged in the best way. Brian Friedman was not there to serve you the usual coma-inducing legal mumbo-jumbo. He wasn't pulling that whole "we're confident in our position, no further comment" snooze fest. No, this man came with a message, and that message was aimed straight at Blake Lively and her entire squad. And look, I've watched a million of these courthouse step interviews. Most lawyers look like they're either about to cry or about to read a teleprompter. Brian Friedman looked like neither. He looked like a guy who already knew how the movie ends and was just vibing on everyone else's suspense. That's not a fake energy. That's earned energy. Now, to get why that moment was such a big deal, you have to rewind to where Justin was just 1 year back. His name was getting trashed everywhere. Job offers were vanishing. His reputation, built for years on being all vulnerable and emotionally naked, was being twisted into a weapon against him. The dude made a whole career out of being real and open, and somehow that exact openness became the thing people tried to bury him with. Always bugged me, that part. But on those courthouse steps, something had flipped. Brian wasn't doing damage control. He was radiating something that felt a whole lot like confidence, maybe even relief. And then he dropped something that genuinely froze me. He talked about Justin maybe becoming a public speaker, specifically for people who've been falsely accused. And his exact phrasing was, people who have been beaten up by a power dynamic. Think about what that really means for Blake's camp. Justin isn't slinking off into the shadows pretending nothing happened. He's actively putting himself front and center as the poster child for what happens when unchecked celeb power attacks the wrong person. That story doesn't just disappear. That story follows Blake around for a very, very long time. Brian also got legitimately choked up talking about what this whole nightmare did to Justin personally. He talked about how it smashed his ego, his pride, his sense of vulnerability, and knowing what Justin has put out there publicly over the years, that tracks completely. Oh, please. This is not some buttoned-up Hollywood robot who shoves every feeling into a lockbox. Justin Baldoni turned vulnerability into his whole damn personality. He's got TED Talks. He built a fan base on it. So when the attacks hit, they didn't just bruise his career. They went straight for the very thing that makes him him. But here's what recently yanked everyone back to their screens. The so-called evidence Blake Lively's team dropped has been crumbling like a stale cookie under any real pressure. And the cringiest example? The deposition of her personal chauffeur, a guy named Mr. Alexander. When whispers first started, Blake's camp teased that it contained genuinely horrifying revelations about Justin's conduct, the kind of tease that makes folks brace for something truly nasty. So when the docs finally got unsealed, everyone sat down expecting fireworks. What they actually got? This. The driver said he felt weird because Justin was chatting about deeply personal, emotional topics in the back of the car. Hold up. Justin Baldoni is an actor and director working on a film drenched in heavy, intense themes. He's been publicly yapping about these exact subjects for years through podcasts, TED Talks, interviews. Him dissecting the emotional heart of the script he's directing is not creepy. That's literally his job description. But the part that truly got me was the other thing the driver flagged as disturbing. Justin pointed out the window and showed them his house. "That's the big bombshell," Justin said. "Hey, that's my place," while cruising past it in a car. I had to read that multiple times because I couldn't process that this was being submitted as evidence of anything. And now it gets even juicier. Because this exact same move, a powerful person in a car driving a younger actress around, pointing out where he and his famous buddies lived, has happened before in Blake Lively's own history. During press for The Town, Ben Affleck casually described driving a then 21-year-old Blake through Boston neighborhoods for research, pointing out his house, where Matt Damon grew up, the whole tour. Nobody called that disturbing. Nobody lodged a single complaint. Blake Lively herself seemed totally okay with it back then. But when Justin Baldoni pulls the exact same move, suddenly a chauffeur's vague ick feeling gets blown up into a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. That contradiction isn't subtle, it's screaming. And then there's the allegation that I think stung Justin the deepest. Not just in court, but in his soul. Blake Lively's team claimed Justin had confessed to some addiction on set, and that confession was why she felt unsafe. That spin went viral. It became the public story about him. Here's what actually went down. Justin wrote a book where, with total honesty and self-reflection, he talked about an unhealthy past habit involving certain content. He was being introspective. He was doing that exact emotional labor he's always preaching about publicly. He never said the word addiction. He never framed it that way. But Blake Lively's crew took that genuine admission and twisted it into something he never uttered. And when you add that to Blake Lively's own sworn deposition, where she admitted she doesn't actually recall specific details of what supposedly happened on set, just the overall vibe, the whole foundation starts looking wobblier than a Jenga tower. You can't build a real legal case on feelings and mangled book quotes. At least you really shouldn't be able to. So let's get into what actually went down inside that Manhattan federal courtroom on June 1st, because the hearing was just as juicy as Brian Friedman's energy outside. After the main lawsuit got settled, Blake Lively's team didn't walk off. The claims were tossed. Justin and his company paid zero of the hundreds of millions in damages originally demanded, and most folks figured that was the finish line. Nope. Blake's squad kept pushing. They filed a separate motion begging for legal fees, costs, and extra damages, even after the settlement. Their argument? They were still owed certain expenses even though the case had already wrapped without a trial. And hey, I get it. Legal fees are painfully real and they stack up fast, but the way they chased this raised some very awkward questions inside that courtroom. Blake Lively's attorney, Ellen Goer, argued that Blake deserved financial recovery despite the settlement. But Justin's legal team fired back hard. Their stance was brutally simple. You can't dodge a full trial, settle, and then expect the same payday you'd have gotten if you'd actually won. That's not how any of this works. You made the choice to settle. You live with the fallout of that choice. But here's where it gets really interesting legally. The entire foundation of Blake Lively's fee grab was California Civil Code Section 47.1. Yep, that's the law her team was desperately clinging to. Under certain circumstances, a defendant who actually wins against a defamation claim can recover attorney fees, costs, and other damages. Blake Lively's lawyers argued that since Justin Baldoni had filed a defamation counterclaim against her, which later got tossed, she qualified as the winning defendant and deserved those protections. Sounds reasonable at first glance, right? Except the issue wasn't just whether the law applied. The issue was how her team tried to weaponize it. They chased these remedies through a federal Rule 54 motion, which is normally used to request attorney fees and routine costs after a case wraps up. Justin Baldoni's lawyers fired back that going after much larger compensatory and punitive damages through that same shortcut was legally sketchy, because those kinds of damages usually require actual evidence, fact-finding, and a way more detailed review than some post-case motion allows. And Judge Louis Lyman clearly had major side-eye about all of this. Before the hearing even started, he publicly stated that he was assuming, without deciding, that relief under Section 47.1 could even be pursued through a Rule 54 motion. That phrasing is everything. Judges don't talk like that when they're comfortable with an argument. That's the language of a judge who's already skeptical and is basically waving a warning flag at both sides. Inside the courtroom, Blake Lively's attorney, Michael Gottlieb, tried to present several things as already established facts. He argued that Blake Lively's communications were protected, made in good faith, and that there was zero evidence of wrongdoing on her part. And Judge Louis Lyman shot back almost instantly. He made it crystal clear that none of those issues had been formally decided by the court and could not just be treated as settled facts. That's a massive deal because Blake Lively's entire damages argument was leaning on conclusions the judge flat out refused to accept as given. Then came the Seventh Amendment bomb, which honestly I think should terrify Blake Lively's team the most. The Seventh Amendment protects your right to a jury trial in civil cases. And when Blake Lively's attorney tried to paint this whole thing as a simple fee motion, Judge Lyman pointed out that the damages being asked for potentially went way beyond normal attorney fees. If we're talking millions in compensatory or punitive damages, Those aren't things a judge just decides alone in a post-settlement motion. Those are things that might demand a jury. And if a jury gets involved, that means more discovery, more testimony, more depositions, more of everything both sides presumably wanted to avoid when they settled. Now here's another layer most people miss. Even if you give Blake Lively's team every legal benefit imaginable, the actual amount she could possibly recover is probably way smaller than her team has been hinting at. Section 47.1 only applies to the defamation claim specifically, not the other 6 causes of action in the original complaint, just that one. And that defamation claim wasn't filed against Blake Lively alone. It was filed against 4 defendants: Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, Leslie Sloan, and Wayfarer Entertainment, or Vision Incorporated, depending on the filing. All 4 shared legal representation for much of this circus, so even if fees got awarded under the statute, trying to pin the entire amount on Blake Lively individually when costs were split across multiple defendants is a nightmare argument to make. Then there's the reputational harm angle. Blake Lively's team claimed she suffered reputation damage and lost professional opportunities because of Wayfarer's lawsuit against her. And Judge Lyman looked genuinely unimpressed, because the catch with any reputational damages claim is you have to prove a direct causal link between the specific legal filing and the specific harm. You can't just wave at the general chaos, the media coverage, the social media pile-ons, the public dumpster fire, and say all that equals damages caused by Justin Baldoni's lawsuit. You have to prove this specific action caused this specific harm. That's way harder to pull off than it sounds. Blake Lively's team originally claimed her damages were somewhere around $150 million. She later dropped the emotional distress part of that claim, and ultimately she walked away from the case without a trial win, without a damages award, and with this 47.1 motion as basically her last and only play. That is a major step back from where her team originally stood. And honestly, that tells you everything about how much weaker their position has gotten throughout this whole legal train wreck. So when you zoom out and look at the full picture, what emerges is pretty brutal for Blake Lively's side. And I'm not saying that lightly. I really tried to see every angle here. Judge Lyman, based on everything from that June 1st hearing, seems to have at least 3 ways he could go. He could deny Blake Lively's request completely. If he decides Rule 54 is simply the wrong procedural tool for the kind of cash she's chasing, he could rule that if she wants this level of relief, she needs to file an entirely new lawsuit and start from absolute zero. Or he could allow some kind of limited proceeding, but demand a much more detailed evidentiary process before any damages number gets set. That third option? That's the one that should genuinely terrify Blake Lively's team, because a full evidentiary process means witnesses. It means documents. It means sworn testimony. It means everything that was already awkward about this case gets shoved under a microscope again. More discovery. More depositions. More of Blake Lively's own words and decisions getting picked apart in open court. Given how her deposition already went, where she admitted she doesn't actually remember the specific details of what she claimed happened on set, I'm not convinced her team wants another round of that kind of heat. And I think on some level her lawyers know this, because when you do the math, pushing this motion aggressively could cost more in time, legal fees, and public embarrassment than whatever she might actually claw back at the end. Especially when you remember how limited that Section 47.1 recovery really is, applying only to the defamation claim and split across 4 defendants. Meanwhile, Justin Baldoni's legal team has been playing this like chess masters. They haven't tried to blow up the proceedings or turn every hearing into a reality show. They've been focused and methodical, challenging the motion on procedural and legal grounds instead of rehashing every drama bomb from the past year. Their argument has basically been, let the court actually look at whether Blake Lively is legally entitled to what she's begging for. That's a disciplined game plan, and honestly, it's been working. Now, I want to circle back to Brian Friedman for a sec, because I keep replaying that courthouse steps moment and what it really meant beyond just legal swagger when he talked about Justin possibly becoming a public speaker for people who got wrongfully accused and beaten down by a power dynamic. That was not some throwaway line. That was a deliberate rewrite of this entire story, because right now the messy public narrative around this case is still all over the place for a lot of folks. There are still Blake Lively stans who believe her version completely. There are still people who think Justin Baldoni did something shady, even if they can't quite say what. Public opinion on something like this doesn't flip overnight. But if Justin Baldoni steps into that speaker role, if he starts showing up at events and giving interviews, specifically framing himself as someone who survived a false accusation campaign driven by Hollywood power imbalance, that narrative starts hardening in a very particular direction. He stops being just some guy who was in a lawsuit. He becomes a symbol, and symbols are way harder to fight than individuals. Blake Lively, on the flip side, is dealing with a very different public moment right now. The It Ends With Us promo campaign fallout never really fully disappeared. That carefully built image took some real punches. And now, with this post-settlement legal fight still playing out in public view, every new development is another chance for people to revisit the whole story and ask questions she probably desperately does not want asked. What gets me about all this is the contrast in how both sides have handled the public dimension of this case. Justin Baldoni has stayed relatively quiet, letting his legal team do the talking, showing emotional vulnerability through his attorney's statements rather than through his own public meltdowns. Blake Lively's team has leaned hard on narrative control, media strategy, and projecting strength even when the legal position underneath that projection has been crumbling. And that gap between the shiny image and the ugly legal reality is, I think, exactly what Brian Friedman was highlighting when he strolled up to those cameras. He didn't need to say Blake Lively is losing. He just needed to stand there looking like a guy who already knew what the other side was about to find out. For Justin Baldoni personally, the past year has clearly taken a real toll. Brian Friedman said as much openly. The ego, the pride, the vulnerability, all of it shaken. But the fact that he's described as being in great spirits now, combined with the possibility of this new public advocacy direction, suggests that whatever happens next in that courtroom, Justin Baldoni is not someone who's slinking away quietly. He came into this as a director and actor who built his whole identity around being emotionally honest in an industry that usually rewards the exact opposite. He got punished hard for that. But if Brian Friedman's courthouse energy was any clue about where things are heading, the punishment phase might finally be over, and what comes next for Justin Baldoni could end up being bigger than anything that came before. That's what makes this whole situation so genuinely fascinating to me. It started as a behind-the-scenes Hollywood conflict that went public in the messiest way possible. It became a legal battle that dragged in subpoenas, depositions, driver testimonies, and federal court hearings. And it might end with Justin Baldoni standing in front of audiences around the world, telling his story on his own terms. Drop your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely want to know where you stand on all of this. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you even doing? Because we are going to keep tracking every development as it